You can start whenever.
Good morning, Mark Conlock, Director of Horticulture here at Green Bay Botanical Garden. Just another Manic Monday here at GBBG. I want to talk a little bit today about pruning and planting, 2 P's. So, one thing you can start doing in your yard is our shrubs are starting to push growth. So this is a tree peony, which is actually a shrub because it has woody tissue here, so that's kind of cool. And what's also cool is the foliage when it comes out is like this really neat dark purple color. And you can also see the flower bud here. So it's kind of nice to let it start growing a little bit so you don't cut those flowers off. So what we did was we kind of tipped it back a little bit. And you can see now that it's growing, we can do some more fine tuning. And you can do this in your own yard. Like, for example, this guy here we thought was alive, but it's really dead. So what I'll do is I will come over here and I'll cut it down here. And I'll get that dead wood out of there to help clean the shrub up. And you can see this one here too, same thing. We thought it was alive and it's actually crossing and rubbing. So that's one that I'm going to cut out now. So when you make your pruning cut, you want to have it at a slight angle and you want to kind of prune it back to the main trunk if possible. Or to another branch or bud going outward. So on this tree peony and some of your other hydrangeas and things, it's pretty easy. You just look for the live growth and then cut it back to there. One other funky thing I want to tell you though is that tree peonies oftentimes are grafted onto herbaceous peonies. So on this one here, this growth here is actually the understock herbaceous peony. So oftentimes what we need to do is get rid of all that stuff. I mean, it's kind of sad because you're getting rid of something that actually does have a flower bud, but this guy will steal energy from our showstopper, which is our tree peony. So we actually kind of have to cut all this stuff off of here. And eventually this will be like the nurse root system, and this guy will take over and put his own roots out, and then this guy won't be there anymore. So that's just like a little special thing for tree peonies. Now, most of you probably have roses. You might not have the cool tree peonies, but get some if you don't have them. And you can see on this rose here, it is starting to push out new growth. So again, one thing we can do is prune it back to live growth. And on the roses, again, you want to prune it to a bud that's going outward. Because most plants, once you prune them, it actually stimulates growth. And typically the next 3 buds grow, the top one the most. So you don't want to prune it to like this bud here, because that's going back into the plant. And if you do that on all of them, they'll be all crisscrossing and it'll be a big mess in here. You won't have good airflow. You'll be more likely to set up disease problems because when water sits on the leaf, it creates the right environment for disease, and you're kind of like pruning it to make it more problems for yourself. The other thing I like to do when I'm first kind of cleaning these guys up is look for the dead wood and cut that out. So that's another really good starting point. And in fact, that's what I would do first, honestly, is I'd go through and look for all the dead wood and cut that out. And sometimes even if it has a little bit of live, I'll cut it out anyway because it's mostly dead. And if you can't tell the difference, one thing you can do is scratch the stem with your pruner. So you can see even though that guy looked dead, it actually has green cambium, so it's alive. But since there's this bud here that I pruned out previously, and now that I scratched it, I might cut it back here. But a lot of times also what I'll do if I scratch it is I'll just kind of put it back in place. Okay, so that's the rose. I mean, one thing to remember with all pruning is you can always prune more off, but you can't like glue it back together with crazy glue. So start slow and you can always cut more off if you don't like the look of it. The other thing with the roses and other things you prune is like take a look at it from a lot of different angles and kind of like shape it up too. So oftentimes it's good to prune, step back, get a whole new angle and look at it, and then come back at it instead of just like going all crazy on it. So this Turkish filbert tree here, it's getting a little bit where you might not want to prune it because it's starting to push live new growth here. So trees you typically want to prune when they're dormant. So you can see this guy's breaking dormancy. But one thing you can do is look for dead wood. And if you see it like here, there's a little stub here. So I can't really reach out with my pruner, but I could come over here and grab my lopper, of course, and reach up and prune it out. And there's another one I see here. So a tree would have to try to seal over the top of that. So if you can clean off all those little nubs, it'll help the tree actually, so it won't have to seal over that. Another thing you could do is take a look for crossing branches. You know, I happened to see like one up here, but that was actually a branch I saw that was dead and had just fallen off. So boom, fixed. But over here you can see this guy is like crossing and gonna rub. So over time that's gonna be a problem. So taking one of those out would be a good idea. Now again, it's really, you know, a little bit past the time you want to do this. You typically want to do this in the kind of late winter time. But I'm gonna do it anyway just to show you, and because sometimes around here, the best time to do it is when you see it, because we have so much going on that you never get back to it. And that might be the case in your own yard too. So those are a couple little pruning things you can do. You know, always like start with the dead stuff, and then you can always take on more after that. Now, let's get to another fun thing. How about adding a little bit of color to your yard? You know, it's the beginning of springtime, things are starting to bloom. We're all excited to get some plants going. So whether you order something and pick it up curbside, or you shop at a social distance, or you order online, here's some of the plants that you could use in a spring container to add a little pop of color to your yard. So we have these frizzle sizzle pansies. These guys can take some cold, they can take a frost. We have a couple different kinds of snapdragons here. Again, all these crops can take it cool out, and they can even take some frost. We have this sweet alyssum. I really love the smell of this, and every time we put it out, the bees and all the little, you know, pollinators in the beginning of the season will go at it. We have some different kinds of lettuce here. We have this really cool dark one. We have a light one. We have dianthus. It's not blooming now, but it has some flower buds, and that's another one that can take it cold. And then petunias are another great crop. They can handle the cold, and they will also then, you know, be there in your container all season. So you could kind of like put them in the springtime and then take out some of the other stuff as it fades and replace it with other plants. So you can kind of get your money's worth out of these babies. One thing that we like to use here is this soilless media. So, and this is just a big tub that we get from Walmart. So we just actually like to mix this in here with Osmocote, which is a slow release fertilizer, and top off our pot. So what I did before this is I kind of mixed up everything that was in there, and then I added and refreshed it with some new soilless media. And then this is just like one little combo that I thought of. I like to color echo things. I learned that from Linda Patton, gardener extraordinaire, who was one of my mentors when I first started here. So you can see this little frizzle sizzle guy kind of color echoes the lettuce. Same with the snapdragon. So it's just like a nice combination. Simple three things, but it looks gorgeous. And the other thing I like about the lettuce is, you know, if you get hungry when you're planting, you can just like nibble on it a little bit. Or the other tip is when you decommission this container and you switch it to your summer container, you have all this lettuce that you could eat. Mm-hmm. So you have like, you know, ornamental edible right here.
So Mark, we have a question from Christine. She asks, can you reuse dirt from fall planters for spring planters? Like you have leftover dirt from last year?
Yeah, the soil. Yeah, a lot of times what we do is we reuse some of it, and we might like refresh the top, or sometimes another way that I like to, since this stuff, you know, can cost a bit of money, what I like to do is the bottom third of the container, a lot of times we'll put it in compost, mm-hmm. and then we'll usually fill the container actually halfway, and the compost will be in the bottom third, and then we'll put this in there and mix it so there's like a transition layer, and then we'll put just this on the top part, mm-hmm. so that we have the stuff that's, you know, the best growing with the Osmocote in the top, and then it has a transition layer so it doesn't have a perched water table. So that's one way to save yourself some money, and you could reuse, you know, some of the old stuff in the bottom, but then maybe refresh the top part. Yep. A couple other ideas I have is, here's another container that I finished off before we went live and direct with a different lettuce. I threw the alyssum in there because I really like this guy here, and this guy gets to be a nice mounder and bigger, and sometimes it will fade a little bit in the summer, so we replace it. But anyway, it's a great spring guy. But the other thing I like to do is, we talked about pruning before. Well, if you have a dogwood, you usually like to take out a third of the older, bigger stems. Well, you can chop the tops of those babies up to make some sticks to give you a little bit of height in your spring container, because that's a lot of thing that's lacking in our spring plants, is they don't have, you know, like a lot of height. They're small mounder guys, and you know, you always think of the thriller, the filler, the spiller in your container. Well, in the springtime, the stick can be your thriller.
Can you talk more about that, the thriller, filler, and spiller?
Yeah, the thriller, filler, spiller. Well, it's just kind of like a common way of doing a container where you have like a big, tall thing. Like, for example, we could use, it's kind of hard to find these, but this year we started some kale, some Swiss chard, and a mustard. So sometimes your thriller is like a taller, bigger thing. It might have bold foliage. It might have feathery foliage. It's just like something that stands out as like a thriller that first grabs your eyes when you look at a container. In our case, it would be those sticks. Just put a stick in it. And then your fillers are usually mounding plants that make up, a good chunk of it. You oftentimes will step down from the thriller. So here our whole container is pretty much a filler. And then your spiller is something that spills down the side of the container. So in springtime, there's not a ton of spiller options out there. Sometimes you can use actually like a perennial vine, or like, something that you overwintered or buy as like a perennial that you then use, as your spiller. But you don't have to worry about that in the spring so much, honestly. But in the summertime, it's good to think about that. And the spiller sometimes will help, tie that to the ground and just soften the pot a little bit. So anyway, my other idea I had was sometimes when you buy plants, the other thing I was going to tell you is that in the springtime with your container, I like to go crazy and just like fill it pretty fast, because our growing season is so short in the springtime, and you really don't want to wait for it to fill in completely your container, and then you're really ready to switch over to summer in June already. So I like to add more than not so much. So I don't like wait for the mature spacing. I just like jam it in there so it's instantaneous gratification. But if you do have some extra packs, say that you buy like a half a flat or something, you can sprinkle them in the ground around your container as a way to kind of like bring your container down to the ground. And the other thing to possibly think about when you're doing your container is the other plants around there. Like, what are these tulips going to be for their color? What are the other, spring blooming perennials that you have, or spring blooming shrubs? And do you want your container to match those things and complement them, or do you want it to like contrast and be its own whole thing? Or do you even care? Maybe you just want to have your own little creation that you put out there. So
we also have another question from Laura. She asks, how do I safely get rid of thistle in flower beds?
Good luck with that. Just kidding. I mean, you can try to, dig it out and keep trying to dig it so that it like grows itself to death. But every little piece that you don't get is going to come back. There's different herbicides you can try to, but sometimes depending on the thistle, there may or may not be effective. So there's really not a good way to exactly say that, except for like one thing I like to do is just like keep get it out and just try to let it grow itself to death. But it's a challenge for sure. So that's a hard one.
And Karen says she loves the sticks. Yeah, she loves the height, so.
Yeah, that's such an easy thing to do. And I was going to say, you heard the saying, put a fork in it, it's done. Put a stick in it, then your container is done. Stick it. So anyway, those are some tips we have, some ideas from Green Bay Botanical Garden for Mondays with Mark. Check out our Facebook, follow us on Facebook, look at our website, gbbg.org, and look forward to gardening with you. Have a great week.